Hello, everybody. This is Hillary Sloan, and this is Driftwood Conversations. I'm joined today with painter and designer Jed Ochmanek. He joins me to talk about the long arc of making, why he courts beautiful inefficiency, how the desert acts like a mirror, and the tension he loves, rigid geometry versus organic flow. We discuss his port paint video work made for ambient pioneer Laraaji with collaborator Merz, the Washington Color School's influence, and building a stripped-down compound that lets light do the talking. We also touch on survival as an artist, West Coast versus East Coast, art worlds, and why good art creates more metaphysical space than it takes up. I'm with Jed Ochmanek, and I'm glad to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I first met Jed through JTHAR, Joshua Tree Highlands Artist Residency, and I believe that was about 2014.
I had moved to Los Angeles in 2005 after college and visited the high desert for the first time shortly thereafter. And I was immediately struck by this landscape and envisioned myself working and living here. In 2014, I was working on a series of paintings in Los Angeles, and I was having difficulty getting them to dry exactly the way that I'd poured them. And my gallerist at the time, Kate Hilseth, who ran a wonderful space called Young Art, knew of this residency in the Joshua Tree area and suggested I apply, thinking that the heat and aridity out here would help with this painting problem. And so I did, because I was also very curious as to what it would be like to be here alone for an extended period of time making work. And it turned out to be really some of the most productive and inspiring periods of my life. And so Fred and Jim were nice enough the next year to set me up with a house sit so that I was here the next summer. It was in 2016 that we bought the place here.
You came out with your partner.
Yes, Marina Wagner.
And since then have gotten married and have a baby.
Yes, she just turned 1 year old, so we had a very momentous baby birthday party, a very special time all around. It's Elka Ardis Ochmanek is her name. Beautiful little baby.
She is.
Yeah.
The Fred and Jim that Jed mentioned are the founders of JTHAR, and I'll put the details of that residency into the Substack announcement. Tell me about this space. You bought this house, you have some property, and you have different buildings. And what are you doing with it?
I was looking for a place that had a lot of pre-existing buildings. I kind of tend to do a lot of different things materially in art, and I wanted different spaces for different purposes. And so I was sort of looking for the classic desert compound, an eccentric previous owner who would have had use for multiple outbuildings. And we found such a space on Yucca Mesa. It's the sort of definition of biting off maybe more than you realize. At the time, I sort of thought it would take about 2 years to wrangle these various buildings into a certain state. And here we are 10 years later, and we're still working on it. It has been rewarding, and it's given us freedom in that sense to have different buildings for different projects.
Also, you talked about turning it into an artist gallery.
Yes, there's a building we've most recently finished, which is sort of a multi-purpose building. It's both of our offices, but we've made the first 2 rooms convertible into gallery space by use of a large pocket wall. We haven't launched it yet, but the idea is that we'll occasionally host other artists there under the name First Light as an artist-run gallery run by my wife and I.
It's very elegant. I had a really good feeling about it.
I wanted to create a place where all of the interiors are sort of up to a specific level, and they're stripped down and refined and sort of hyper neutral to the point where they sensitize you to the minute changes of light quality, color in the environment around us. So in a way, it's sort of getting out of the way so that the landscape Marina and I have put in can sort of flow through the interiors. I mean, one of the best compliments I got was our friend Heidi, who runs the Material Lab, came over, and I had just finished painting everything white in the interior of the house, and it was a particularly sort of gray day, and she said, "Why did you paint the inside of your house blue-gray?" No, actually, the house is a blank screen on which the desert and the light and shadow sort of can play. It's that sort of attention and patience I want to bring to the creation of art and the reception of art. There's a slowness and a kind of inefficiency to art that I think we're in danger of losing some of.
Now, did you say inefficiency?
Inefficiency. Art is not a particularly efficient means of communication. Visual art, certainly.
Why is that?
Referring to painting and sculpture or versus digital media, just the speed of creating it, the fact that it's sort of resistant to mechanical reproduction. These are challenges and shortcomings that I've sort of decided to focus on as sort of hidden strengths.
Knowing your art, I've seen a lot of color, but there's a movement to it. It almost feels like I could almost compare it to dance. It has a choreography that flows. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, I think so. Central to my work, I think, is this sort of tension between a rigid geometry or a system of proportion which has a way of being sort of absolute or objective. That's sort of what we're doing with our property as well. It's creating a very sort of structured frame through which the light and time and space of the desert can flow. I'm inspired by music, in particular ambient music, which I view as doing a very good job of that. It has these kind of absolute confines. There's a sort of set of rules by which it behaves, a set of physics maybe. But then within that set of physics, there's this ethereal and sort of effortless flow. You get that especially from the music of Laraaji, who I was lucky enough to get to collaborate with, along with my friend Merz the other year. You know, with our house, we centered this very large picture window in front, one of the few places we got to kind of do what we wanted given the existing limitations of the existing structure. And then that in turn aligns with this poured-in-place cement dining table, which is sort of the most, static, commanding element of the build, but centered on that table then is the most open, flowing acacia willardiana that we could find from one of Marina's secret arborist sources.
Oh, it's a plant.
It's a plant, yeah. And I call it our Laraaji tree. He's one of my all-time favorite artists, and I was
He's a musician?
A musician, yeah. I was lucky enough to get to create work for him through my friend Conrad, who also lives out here, whose stage name is Merz. We had a collaboration that began in 2018 for a performance in a former power plant in Switzerland.
Let's stop for a second on your art. We'll come back to
Sure.
it. Tell me where you grew up.
I grew up in Washington, D.C. I was born in Frankfurt, Germany. My dad was in the Foreign Service at the time. Spent 3 years in Los Angeles when I was a little kid, but otherwise East Coast.
Where did you go to art school?
I went to the Rhode Island School of Design, where I studied painting, and then moved out to Los Angeles in 2005.
Did you always feel like you were an artist?
I was always drawn to art. A kindergarten teacher told my mother that Jed's happy when he's working on art, and if I wasn't happy, the art might sort of shut down. I feel like it's always been an outlet for me since I can remember.
You're very intellectual, and your thought process is specific. Does that ever get in the way with communication and with friendships? Do you make friends easily? Is that part of your life, or do you really think about art all the time?
I wouldn't say I think about art all the time. There's been periods of my life that have been very social. I found this amazing deal in L.A. I was talking about it with a friend who wants to write a book about this period in the L.A. art world. That was a 1930s ballroom and banquet hall. 8,000 square feet if you count the backyard. And for the first year having that, we just threw parties. as what we did. It was, I was much younger then. But so someone who can throw a party and have 1,200 people show up has to be able to get out of themselves a bit. But then I've also found the exact opposite can be true, and that, it's the desert has this capacity for solitude where one can really kind of retreat into like a walled garden of their own creativity and their own thoughts. I think that I'm maybe analytical in a sense. Not that my analysis is good or correct, but I'm sort of drawn to the analytical. And I don't know if that's not necessarily a sort of pro-social trait. It makes it very difficult to get along with contractors, let's say. But it's okay at parties. So
contractors out here have been difficult anyway.
Yeah, that's probably a topic for another podcast. We could go for hours on that. I think everyone's had their sort of desert stories, but I think there's something that I really like about the desert as sort of it's sort of selecting for people who are going to have a degree of self-sufficiency in this sense. Everyone's gone through the thing of fixing up a house that they probably should have just knocked down.
I think it allows people to express themselves in a more honest way. Have you found that? You've been living here now a while.
Yeah, I think that the desert itself is an environment that its emptiness is something that you can look upon, but then it in turn looks back at you. That lends itself to a sort of disarming honesty, and one that I see, possibly lacking in the larger contemporary art discourse. Not to be sort of overly sincere or prescriptive, but that sort of situation where you're inhabiting this place that continuously asks of you, what do you represent? There's this great, cartoon of a guy in a museum, pointing at the monochrome and saying, what does this represent? And the monochrome jumps, off the wall at him and says, well, what do you represent? And I think in a way that is what the empty work, the empty canvas, the empty landscape can do for us. It's a screen on which to sort of project our own reality, but then we end up having to like what we see in that projection. You sort of you can turn the analysis in on yourself.
How interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way, but that makes sense to me. Do you have any projects coming up?
Well, actually, next weekend I'm participating in a juried exhibition of architectural design at a new place called New American Designs here in the desert. And been sort of doing this secret foray into architectural design. I mean, I'm still primarily a visual artist. And while I haven't had any new builds constructed yet, I've sort of been spending a fair amount of time the last several years working on architectural design. And so this will be the first time that I've kind of publicly exhibited anything from that effort.
Surviving as an artist, making money, making a living, all of that's very difficult. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Have you found it a challenge?
Sure, but it's also been sort of an education, especially when I first moved to LA. I would work for artists and galleries, and I sort of like to say that, if you took a period of time in the LA art world, it was much smaller when I moved there, and even as recently as 2005. It's completely different now. And between my wife and I, it feels as though we've sort of worked for everyone in that time period. If it was just studio assistant, administration, I would do fabrication for other artists. The first time Marina and I ever saw each other, I was performing for the artist Piero Golia. He had a performance for Land, Los Angeles Nomadic Division, in which he sent me in his stead to fabricate these concrete cakes that ended up in a show he did at Gagosian. And there was, of course, an event photographer, and I said, "Who's the girl behind the camera?" And it was Marina. And so, we met through our mutual effort in this way, where we would work for artists and arts organizations, and in a way, it was sort of like a second education. I was Mike Kelly's gardener, the late great Mike Kelly. Did fabrication for all sorts of artists and so on, and so that taught me to work in a lot of different materials and methods. It sort of showed that, like, if you have a truck and a phone, you could kind of get anything done in Southern California. I liked that attitude surrounding visual art. In a way, it was sort of lacking on the East Coast, I felt.
What's the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast in terms of art?
The sort of Annie Hall, Woody Allen movie stereotype is that the East Coast art scene, the New York art scene, is more serious and intellectual. The West Coast is this sort of hedonistic, sensation-seeking, vacuous culture, and I think there's some truth to that. But there's also, I think, a broader scope of aesthetic possibility, maybe on some level, that I've appreciated from West Coast art. I think, this is probably much more true 75 years ago, but there's something. If East Coast art draws from a sort of European tradition or a rejection of it, abstract expressionism and so on, the West Coast art is sort of untethered from that, and they're probably more interested in Japanese aesthetics than European. Pacific Standard Time series of exhibitions that was sort of spearheaded by the Getty, that sort of made the case for Los Angeles specifically, but West Coast more broadly, art history having reached a point where it's ready to be canonized. And I think the success of that effort galvanized this change in the Los Angeles art world, economically and otherwise, where it sort of maybe died out of success or something. It's
died out of success. So it isn't as potent or vibrant as it was?
It was sort of a cottage industry before, and there was only a few major players and not very many collectors, and it wasn't a terribly international city as far as contemporary art went. And now the problem of becoming an international hub of contemporary art is that you sort of just end up getting, every New York gallery's fourth space is in, L.A. or Seoul. And it kind of becomes a placeless
like a
enterprise.
Cliche,
right?
Yeah. What about Chenard? There were some really powerful artists that came out of that school way back in the 70s.
Yeah. I don't know. I can't speak specifically to that, but
I don't remember all the names. But a friend of mine had a gallery in Robertson. And she showed a lot of those artists. And it was grounded in both history and exploration. But I haven't seen anything lately. I don't know what's happening now. This is a fascinating conversation for me. It's kind of got me excited.
Yeah.
So what's your background? Who inspired you?
Well, growing up in D.C., I was particularly struck by Frederick Edwin Church's Niagara painting. It was at the Corcoran at the time. And there's a sort of central paradox to it. It's not a terribly large painting. It has this extreme horizontality, and so it has this interesting physical presence. But there's this very obvious central paradox that it's depicting something that's both flowing and, in person, Niagara is deafeningly loud. And instead you're in the room with this static, silent object. And the central paradox to that painting and the power of it has really stayed with me in terms of, I think, most of the work that I've made. That returns to that sort of paradox between geometric order and flow. And similarly, I think in terms of art from mid-century on, I was most taken with the Washington Color School, particularly Morris Louis, and particularly his Veil cycle. Those are such gorgeous, delicate, emotive fields of color. These layers of extremely thin poured paint. I believe it was a sort of experimental type of alkyd paint called Magna that he was using on raw, untreated canvas. You really do get the sense that you're looking through these series of successive gestures into something unknown. He sort of had a tragic life. He died young. There's an element of tragedy in the act of pouring itself that's sort of central to those. This sort of impossible desire to extend ourselves beyond, our sort of mortal lifetime, and Niagara and the Morris Louis Veil cycle sort of do that. They sort of reach out through time to the viewer.
I could see that. I don't know those pieces you're mentioning, but I could see that in your poured pieces. That's how you're working now.
Yeah, I felt as though this sort of, I guess, third wave abstract expressionism or something, in a way, it's an unfinished or open project, that there's still room for relevance from that time period and from those artists today. Just because we've had postmodernism in the interim doesn't shut the door on that form of expression. And I'd like to work in an understanding of that into something that feels, in a way, new, but also perhaps isn't too far from the sort of impetus that those artists had. I think color field painting is especially relevant to this conversation about the desert looking back at you. You know, I want this sort of open field of pure light and tone. You get that with music by desert musicians. You know, Harold Budd lived out here in the Josh Switzer Monument House for many decades. And there's these sort of like perfect placid lakes of tone that he's created that it's like watching the clouds in the desert sky pass over. It's an experience that's at once disarming, abstract, but also can be experienced as intensely personal.
Interesting. I mean, it's just giving me a lot to think about. There is one artist out here who does color field, Judy Wald. I never heard her apply that name to it, but she works with tones of colors, hues of colors, and I love them. I love her drawings more because they take me somewhere. For me, it reflects both L.A. and the desert because there's a tension in L.A. and then there's a different kind of tension here in the absence of noise and people.
I'll have to look up her work. That sounds
She'll be
fantastic.
On the art tours.
Okay, cool. I'll have to go visit.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a sort of latent tension to the desert.
Are you going to be on the art tours?
No, I haven't done those. Yeah, there's sort of a latent tension to the experience of the desert.
Latent tension to the desert. There is. Maybe it's a fight between surrender and holding on, because everything in the desert is so hard to survive. You know, the sun and the wind and the heat, it's all so extreme. Nothing has a permanency.
But yes, and then there's also this sense of potential. You know, my favorite smell is the creosote bushes after a rain. Desert petrior, if I'm pronouncing that correct. It's this sort of overwhelming sense of potential. We'll get particularly rainy season, and then you'll have a super bloom from seeds that could have been, sitting dormant in the seed bank for hundreds of years. Marina can speak more, scientifically than I would about exactly how that works here. But there's this sense that the desert is hiding in wait, and that in the right conditions and just only briefly it will come out and reveal itself.
That's true. It's amazing. The first time I saw tadpoles, there was puddles in the park from a recent rain, and these little tadpoles were swimming around.
Right. How did they get there?
They're in the ground.
Yeah.
And after a rain, I just did a story about this. After rain, every bloom in my garden just pops up. And some of them fall off within 24 hours. It's amazing.
Yeah, I love these calicortus lily flowers that we get very, very briefly after a rain. It's these tiny, hyper-saturated orange blooms. Really, they were incredible to find. And it's just this incredibly potent little pop of color in an otherwise sort of barren landscape that really speaks to me on an aesthetic but also very emotive level.
Absolutely. What do you think, and it could be within your art or your life, what's your biggest challenge?
I think I've made some pretty severe miscalculations regarding how hard something might be to do, or how much of a challenge something might be that's kind of in the way of moving on to the next thing. And so, of course, there's the example of miscalculating the number of years it would take to renovate this sprawling and in much worse condition than I had really sort of initially assessed, desert property. But then also I think in art, I'll have a grudge against something or a principle. For instance, I really did not like acrylic paint or acrylic paintings. I did not want to make a plastic painting. And so I was sort of like, well, the only real paintings are oil paintings. And so no matter what, it has to be oil. Even if it's not traditional oil, it's not Old Holland from a tube, it's still technically oil because it's oil-based enamel, something like that. And it turns out that oil-based enamel is toxic and needs to be thinned out with flammable mineral spirits. California, bans the VOC content of the mineral spirits that work, so I have to buy out all of the Home Depots between here and Arizona. When in fact, there's a new water-based alkyd product that really largely resembles a lot of what oil-based enamels do. And so, if you're standing in front of a mountain and you need to get to the other side, there's sometimes this. You sometimes do just have to tunnel through the mountain. But if you're going to tunnel through the mountain, you're going to need something more than a spoon. And if the best that you can do is kind of re-engineer a better spoon to try to get through the mountain, you really should consider simply walking around the mountain. And so I guess it's in a way picking my battles. I will sort of stubbornly have to learn from experience. I should be able to model these various scenarios with language so that I don't actually have to live through failure. But I feel like I have to fail in reality more often than I should to learn.
I haven't heard an artist that doesn't, after a while, begin to credit failure for their success. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can bang your head against a wall 20 times until you really get that that's a hard surface.
Right. Yeah, and I think that something that I've sort of tried to be more aware of is where exactly are my abilities best used in this process. If I'm really committing myself to a incredibly inefficient process, is the commitment to that so meaningful that it's worth not getting to make all sorts of these other decisions creatively? Because we only have so many years to do this. When you kind of get started making your own work, after school, you choose a path and then so much is downstream of that. I would say I also tend to skip around to different media and different bodies of work, and that may prove challenging in terms of what the art market wants you to do. People want a recognizable product. They want a brand name and consistency. And I think that what I'm trying to do is all pushing in a particular direction that adds up as I move through bodies of work, but it can be sort of a challenge to explain to someone, well, why did you do this series of, resin sculptures? How does that relate exactly to painting? And why am I looking at a video now after all of that? But
do you think art can... We're in such a volatile time and a time of change on every level. How we survive, what we do, how the community interacts. Do you think we need to do some serious thinking on how we create the art world we're living in? I'm somebody that loves different experiments. So why would they say don't do it? If you're creative, you're creative.
Right. I think if we're talking about sort of the contemporary art market, investors want to bet on a horse that will run. And so they need to see product and volume. And we're not really talking about people who are going to be purchasing something because they love it or they intend to live with it. This stuff is going into storage as an investment vehicle. And that's sort of this ugly truth about how the art world works. And I think the question of how we shape the art world, it depends on what art world we're talking about. There's many art worlds. I would say it's not necessarily up to artists to do that. If what we mean by art world is sort of the structure of the economics and dissemination of art, what it absolutely is up to artists to do is to create the world that art creates. I think that art is an act, when it's at its best, of world creation. It's the creation of a sort of hypothetical form of existence that the artist has found language insufficient to communicate to others. And so how we create those worlds, which worlds we're describing, what that means to ourselves and to other people, that's in the realm of our control. Fixing the art market really is not. I think it's about creating meaningful work that's in some senses born out of dissatisfaction with the world, because you're really creating a sort of alternative world when you create an artwork. And I find that, especially true with music, but it's also sort of true with visual art. When I talk about this idea of the sort of set of physics as governing abstraction, that's something I see Laraaji doing, for instance. It's sort of as though you set up this set of physics. For him, it might be this sort of floating ethereal world. There's a parameter in which that exists, and then you hit record and you let it flow. That's how I approach abstract painting as well. I think it is about sort of a propositional alternative world, allowing the viewer or the listener or the person experiencing the artwork to momentarily inhabit a propositional alternative to our given reality. I find that with Monet water lilies. I found that with Tadeo Ando architecture, Tarkovsky's movies. Without these propositional worlds, we're really stuck with the one that we have. And that can become very claustrophobic.
Did you ever see Robert Wilson's plays?
No, I haven't.
He's just passed away. And I'm sure there's some video of filming of them. I think you'd really resonate with him. Einstein on the Beach.
Okay, yeah.
And the musicians he worked with, for me, it opened up worlds, and I don't even know how to explain it to most people. But it took all of the concepts that I was holding as an artist and just went, took a breath and blew them away, like the leaves of a plant. It's just gone because it has that much space and imagination.
Yeah, my friend Connor said that all good art creates more metaphysical space than it takes up physical space in the world. And so this idea of breadth, I recently visited the Chichu Art Museum on Naoshima Art Island in Japan. And the newest, or one of the newer museums there's a number of museums, most of which are designed by Tadeo Ando, hosts just 3 artists. There's Monet, James Turrell, and Walter Di Maria. Before you're even in front of a single artwork, you've gone through so many of these sort of incredible and very absolute spaces, these sunken courtyards by Ando, and it's sort of like Stalker by Tarkovsky. You're in another world by the time you're actually in it. He sort of slowly sensitizes you, taking you through these dark passages. You take off your shoes and you're walking on these marble circular floor inlays, and so you're very aware of your body, and you're in this sort of dim antechamber, and then you encounter, and that's really the best word I could use for it, is sort of an encounter with this other vast horizontal Monet water lily. And the day we were there was an overcast day, so it was a very particular light condition, and I'm sure it's not always that way. I sort of whispered to Marina, don't you think this work is breathing out through us? Is there something, why is this of all works here? Why is this sort of being like prioritized? Is there something, unique to Japanese culture that has a tradition of a sort of like divine breath or divine wind in art? That sort of breath of meaning into the world is something that art can emulate, but it's sort of beyond art because it enters like a realm of the sacred or something.
When I was in art school and a bunch of us went to the Modern, I took my grandmother, and she couldn't walk, and she was a Russian peasant, hadn't gone to school, wasn't educated, and sat in front of the water lilies. We came back sometime later, and she was crying. That piece spoke to her so deeply that she was crying. Now, a piece that can touch you intellectually, emotionally, touch somebody that knows very little about art, that's, wow. I don't even know how to explain that.
I think where art can go wrong, the postmodern art, is it becomes very textual. It's sort of a stand-in for text, whereas this reaction to the water lilies is a reaction to something intensely phenomenological. It's becoming aware of your own act of looking. It's getting lost in looking. It's rediscovering modes of looking. It's sensitizing you to, really, painting becomes environmental on that scale. And that's a very emotive thing if you're receptive to it. That's exactly what I like. That space, and being able to find a space like that, create a space like that, and then get to stay there a little while. One of the best compliments I ever received is there's this incredible experimental band called Acceptor. One of their members was at an art fair, and my gallerist just overheard him kind of whispering him to himself, this guy Porkchop, looking at one of the wildest paintings I'd ever made. Oh man, that guy's been out there, and it's just the compliment of that nature from someone who's made such like wildly distorted electronic abstraction is sort of like, well, what's meant by there? It's a space of experience and reaction and gesture. And I've been trying to, in my studio, in a practical sense, eliminate as much of the inertia between gesture and result as I can, so that eventually one day I can sort of just wave my fingers around and judge instantaneously whether what is happening is good or bad. And the more of those decisions, the more of those judgments you can do per hour, if you can pack in tens of thousands of them a day, that's better. And then you're participating in something with the material that's akin to, it's an analogy to world creation. And if you can share that competently with others, then that's a big deal. And there's so much that gets in the way of all of those things. Being a sort of pitiless censor of yourself, getting the things out of the way that are going to impede on communicating that to other people, clearing out what's unnecessary, what's distracting, both in the way you work and the environment in you work and how you work and what you're working on. and then creating an environment that's an opportunity for connection is sort of the best you could try to do, I think. And it's almost entirely failure all the way up until that.
What would you tell new artists entering the field?
I would encourage them to ask themselves honestly if what they want to do is defined by a sort of presentism. There's such a pull toward wanting to make something relevant, wanting to make something new. And that's always been the case, and it's led to incredible innovations. But it can also be a bit of a trap. And I think that maybe what art is good at is, in a lot of ways, stepping outside of not just, the 24-hour news cycle, but even the present moment as such, and asking questions and making observations about like really basic themes of human nature. Does your work express tragedy? Does your work express loss? Does your work express the fallenness of the human condition? Or is your work just reciting today's news? And it's not that today's news can't get us beyond the topical and into the eternal, but it's very easy, I think, to be swept up in a kind of myopic presentism. And that can be fine, and there's certainly a role for that. But I would just ask for like an awareness of that condition. I try to ask myself for an awareness of that condition, certainly.
It's interesting. I wouldn't think of your work as holding sadness or the pain of humanity. It has, maybe because of the colors, but the depth of it, the layers and layers, maybe that would express more?
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything really overtly there about that. I mean, certainly not in the new work, because the new work is really this continuation of this 2018 project that I'd been describing earlier with Laraaji and Merz.
Right, with the music, the musicians.
and that's such bright and open work. But I would say that just within joy is the kernel of its own undoing, or something, or the kernel of there's an awareness even at the height of joy that this is momentary. Like even if, especially like chromatically or whatnot, the new work comes off as particularly joyous, and it is. I think, like Bob Dylan said, behind every beautiful thing there's been some kind of pain.
So the project you're doing with the musicians, is that some of the video that I saw?
Yes. So, yeah. Now I'll just go back and try to
explain that
one. So there was a string of collaborative projects that began in 2018. My friend Conrad Lambert, whose performance name is Merz, asked me would I like to help him in this collaboration that he was proposing with the musician Laraaji. Laraaji is one of the pioneers of ambient music, and he's known for playing a electrified zither instrument, which produces this like incredibly gorgeous, shimmering, vertical, tonal world. And I said, of course, because Laraaji's, one of my favorite all-time artists in any medium. And the initial collaboration took place at a performing arts venue in Bern, Switzerland called Dam Central Bern, a former power plant. And I came up with a sort of feature-length piece of video art that was filming the paint pouring across metal sheets the way that I would make my tonal color paintings, and then treating the layers of video the way that I would treat layers of paint, and layering the video to create a flowing, particulate, highly detailed chromatic event. And then Merz and Laraaji met in the space and reacted to the video and composed a set in reaction to it, which then became, the next year, a double album released by the arts venue, for which I redid the process of adapting it to still photography. Then I remixed the video for Merz's 20th anniversary of his debut album tour the year after that. And it brought photography and video into it took the painting into a space of video and photography, and that sort of allowed for this thing that I really value about video and sort of like digital creative space is the ability to undo and to test out before committing. Whereas with painting, in these layers, it's that I'm working in, it's really kind of all or nothing. And if you want to take a step back, well, too bad. That work was sort of the most exuberantly chromatic work I had ever made. I sort of credit them with pulling me out of a rut in a way. My assignment was to sort of try to articulate this music that I loved so much, but that I wasn't capable of making myself. And sometimes collaborations and assignments like that can be incredibly helpful in kind of allowing you to step outside of yourself. So I've been lucky to collaborate with a number of musicians afterwards. There was another collaboration with the composer Seth Olinsky. And so that work kind of informed a number of other projects since, pulling painting into a digital space, putting video into an architectural space, bringing into the work a literal flow, because it's this very slowly pouring solution of oil-based enamel and mineral spirits that I was filming, and putting into a space of duration, creating a literally durational work.
So is this project still going on?
No, the Merz and Laraaji project is sort of concluded, but I did re-show some of that video work in a new context last year for a show with Compound Yucca Valley, and the album artwork served as kind of the basis for this series of prints that I showed there as well. They're these inkjet prints on slightly pearlescent metallic paper in these welded cold-rolled steel float frames, and it was sort of this the desire to take something out of the photography space and put it more into a space that has the presence of painting in a way. They have a weight to them. There's a sort of weightlessness to the digital image that I wanted to try to avoid. I'm planning work in a similar vein, but that will be from new shoots, new material.
How can people find you and see this work?
My website is jedochmanek.com. I'm currently redoing it, but and my Instagram account is at Jed Ochmanek Studio with underscores in between. So Jed _Ochmanek _studio.
Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing more. Is there anything you want to say to wrap up?
Oh, well, just thanks so much for having me. And I think it's great what you're doing, getting these conversations with creative people in the desert. And it's a real honor and pleasure to get to share what I've been working on with you.
Thank you. I really appreciate your work.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My time with Jed Ochmanek left me deeply inspired. His way of seeing, quiet, disciplined, and open to mystery, reminds me that art can still surprise us. Jed brings a rare sophistication to his practice, not through intellect alone, but through presence, through the attention he gives to light, sound, and time itself. You can learn more about his work at jedochmanek.com or follow him on Instagram at Jed_Ochmanek_studio. The music in this episode is from Dreams of Sleep and Wakes of Sound by Merz, Laraaji, and Shahzad Ismaily. You can find their work at merz.co.uk on Bandcamp and at laraaji.blogspot.com. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of this unfolding conversation about art awareness and the many ways we wake to beauty. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and refer it to friends. Until next time, this is Driftwood Conversations, and I'm Hilary Sloan.